Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Conversations for the Future. I'm Lee Steinke with Foundation for the Future. It's good to see you all again on the Zoom, and I also want to welcome our live stream viewers who are about 6,000 strong each month. This month, we're talking a little bit about space investment with a variety of other topics sprinkled into the mix, including special segments What's Going On with Laura Forsick and Saturday Space with James Vaughn. Now, last month, our executive director, Tim Chrisman, interviewed David Logston, and they talked about NASA's soft power brand and the need for Space Force to get on that train and have logo apparel widely available. I said I'd like to have one of those t-shirts, and I was going to start working on that for Space Force. And I'm happy to report that Dr. Joel Mosier at Space Force has come through for me. And I'm donning my brand new Space Force t-shirt for you today. Now I'll do one for the screen grab. Okay. You can express your envy freely in the chat, and hopefully soon they will be selling those out in the world. All right, and without further ado, I want to bring in the Foundation's Executive Director, Tim Chrisman. He's a former CIA and Army intelligence officer who supported the National Space Council and the Joint Staff at the Pentagon. He holds master's degrees from American University in Intelligence Studies and International Relations and Affairs. And he is the author of the book Humanity in Space. He speaks and writes articles about space infrastructure development and the expansion of our civilization to space. Tim's next challenge and mission is to make space accessible, survivable, and ultimately routine enough to be boring. Tim, take it away.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lee. And yeah, that's a fantastic shirt. I now need to give Joel a hard time. And that's the problem. Once you give one away, now you're stuck.
I know.
Yeah, man, that's cool. Well, welcome to all of you in the room and beyond. It's exciting to be back another month into 2022 after what has seemed like a whirlwind 30 days. We're already, getting to the middle to the end of February, and while the weather is certainly reinforcing the time of year, definitely doesn't seem this late. I wanted to take some time today. Normally during this time block, I sort of introduce Foundation, whatever one of our new initiatives are at the time, but wanted to take some time to talk about what's happening, whether it's here in DC, out in the rest of the US with our workforce development, and then what's coming next. So I figured that that might be a nice change of pace for those of you who are here a lot and may normally use my presentation for a nap. So
Do that, Tim.
As I was saying, it's the last month has been quite busy, and not just for us here at the Foundation. I want to talk a little bit about the government and what has been happening on Capitol Hill and where we see some of that going from here. Then I'll jump into the workforce. So on the government affairs side, there's really about three numbers that matter when we're talking about the way to look at what's happening in DC and a lens through which to look at what's coming. Those numbers start with the number one. I feel like I'm the count on Sesame Street. So we have 1 day left of government funding under the current continuing resolution. There is widespread expectation that another continuing resolution will be passed, giving the House and Senate about 3 weeks to finish wrapping up the funding bills for this fiscal year, which for those of you who aren't familiar with government fiscal years, started back in October. So the government's already been running for half its fiscal year on these continuing resolutions, which means everything stayed at its funding level from 2021. And a lot of the major programs that have been passed over the past 6 to 9 months, including the bipartisan infrastructure bill, haven't been funded. And so none of that money can start going out the door yet. The second number is 7. So 7% inflation is what the economy is currently running at. And regardless of whether you're in the camp of this is transitory or the sky is falling, that number has a very real impact here in DC. That inflation number in no small part derailed a lot of talks around new COVID relief money, new investments in infrastructure, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But that is something that is going to be a huge issue over the next 3 to 6 months as we see whether it goes down, continues to stay high, and ultimately, if it remains high, is going to be a ongoing source of friction and one of the main things that prevents things from getting done here. And the final number is 30. That is the number of House Democrats who have said they're going to retire before the 2022 election. Typically, every election cycle, there are a handful of members retire for various reasons, whether it's they think they can't win or they're want to move on to something else. But this year, it's an unusually high number of Democrats and an unusual grouping of senior Democrats. On the Republican side, it's been 15 members who have said they're going to not run again. Most of those are junior to mid in terms of seniority. On the Democrat side, easily half of their 30 are senior subcommittee or committee chair people, and most specifically of interest to those of us in the space community. Representative DeFazio, who has led the House Transportation Committee, is retiring. He has been a long-standing skeptic of space as a transportation modality, as a viable sector. And so it'll be interesting to see as he is replaced next year, regardless of which party takes the election, how that shifts the thinking in that committee. So those are the 3 numbers. As you can see, some of those were addressed here on the slide, but I want to dig in a little bit more on the infrastructure bill and then the election. So as I mentioned, the inflation numbers have been persistently high and have been a big reason why Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema have both come out in opposition to the president's reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better bill that you may have heard in other words. And they have more or less said that it is dead. They're not going to revive it. And so while there is a small chance that the president and the Democrats may be able to negotiate a smaller version of it that brings back maybe the child tax credit or some form of investment in human infrastructure, it's highly unlikely that anything in that bill is going to be expansive enough to include investments in the space sector. We're still waiting for the NASA authorization bill to pass. It looks like it's not likely to pass again this year. And so space really has remained something that is an afterthought in this Congress as they continue to fight over the fallout from January 6th. It's been over 400 days since that occurred. And again, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, that has shifted how Congress works with itself in a very fundamental way. Before, a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the attacks were public, but didn't convert to actual private animosity. That has shifted to the point where there is a growing sense on Capitol Hill that each party is out to get the other in a very personal and visceral way. And that has significantly eroded the trust that both sides need in order to work bipartisan legislation. That's not to say there is no one on the Hill that can work together, but it has been a noticeable tone shift. And that's not just us that is hearing that. In our interactions on the Hill, I was at the Commercial Spaceflight Federation members meeting yesterday. Their lobbyist from KL Gates, Paul Stilmers, mentioned the very same thing and gave an anecdote about how one senior member of Congress was talking about how their view was that there was no point ever working with anyone who ostracized Republicans this last year, essentially saying, if you didn't stand with us during this dark time, don't ever come back to us again to ask for anything. And so that is a ill omen, if you will, for future cooperation over the next year, at least through the election, if not beyond. And so getting to the election, the failure of the bipartisan infrastructure, or the failure of the partisan infrastructure bill, that Build Back Better bill, really marked the end, or what we assess to be the end of any serious legislation coming out of DC until the election. There will continue to be bills that are passed in both the House and Senate. Some of them may be actually passed together and passed into law, but a lot of them are going to end up being messaging bills that allow members of Congress to go on the record and to say they are for something, they voted for something. And there will probably be a handful of bills that pass, not necessarily related to space. But the election is going to start eating up more and more of Congress's time and attention. And already they have less than 100 days of work. I believe it's actually under 70 days of work now between now and the election. So it's not a lot of time. They have to get funding bills from last year finished, finish funding bills for this current year. And so we expect it to be a pretty stagnant environment for any legislation, at least through the election. So a relatively dour picture I just painted about the current situation in Congress and here in DC in general. And so what we're trying to do, recognizing the fact that this is the environment we're in, is trying to address the issue that a lot of space organizations have of holding the attention of members of Congress. Very often when nonprofits and space organizations go up to Capitol Hill, they get widespread interest in what they're talking about. Many members will signal their support and be interested in helping, but then that good intention, whether it is sincere or not, gets overcome and overwhelmed by events. And so that is in part because the average member of Congress spends about 7.5 hours a day on fundraising calls. So if you can imagine that much of your day spent just raising money so you can keep your job, doesn't leave a lot of time for other things, and often would make you lose focus on whatever it was you just talked about, not related to raising money. So recognizing that fact, and that's just the world we live in, the Association for the Future has supported the launch of a Space Political Action Committee. This is a hybrid PAC. So if you've heard of super PACs, it's a similar formulation to that, but it is a political action committee meant to represent the interest of the space economy at large. It's not meant to be the sole a sole tool for us here at the foundation or the association, but instead a nonpartisan organization that can donate to both sides of the aisle and be responsive to the priorities that are set by a broad coalition of policy organizations in the space sector. And so we've already started talking to a number of organizations about creating an objective third-party score that this political action committee can use in order to gauge who in Congress should get its donations and who should have their opponents funded. And so ultimately, this will end up looking like something like how the NRA or Emily's List create scores that gauge almost like a report card, what grade politicians get in terms of their support for or against bills that favor them. And so that I think is an exciting new tool that the space sector at large now has to get politicians in a room and actually listen in order to combine those two things that Congress people do, raising money and making policy. One of the first things this political action committee is going to do is a series of fundraising dinners with members of Congress. And the idea behind this is this will give not only the PAC the ability to raise its profile with members of Congress here by hosting these events where they can raise money, but it also lets the PAC bring in voices from across industry. So these dinners will be small, 10 to 15 people who pay between $1,000 and $2,500 to come attend the dinner, talk with the member of Congress about what's going on, whether it's with their company, with issues they care about, and spend a couple hours in that personal engagement with a member of Congress so they can, that way, it benefits the member on the policy side as well, so they can get a better understanding of what the rest of us are thinking and not just what their staff is feeding them. And so over the next few weeks, we'll be announcing which members of Congress are going to be participating in this dinner series, and hope to have 1 to 2 of these a month over at least the next 6 to 9 months through the election, and then hopefully beyond that, so we can continue to engage these members who are friendly to the space sector, but maybe not one of the traditional ones, not one of the ones that sits on the science and tech committees, but that sit on, maybe it's transportation, maybe it's labor, and that are interested in space and want to know more about how they can help. The final thing that we're working on over the next 30 to 60 days is starting to engage more with the House Financial Services Committee. This is a committee that governs a lot of the regulations for the finance community. And as we see that there is an increasing likelihood that the next Congress will see Republicans take over, we're trying to determine what the sentiment is on both sides of the aisle for regulating the space sector. There's been a lot of talk this last year about new regulations, be they safety or financial, related to investments in space. And we're trying to gauge, where is that thought right now? especially with the potential new majority? And how can we start shaping that to ensure that these early conversations members and their staff are having are ones that are favorable to us in the industry? Turning to workforce, the Good Jobs Challenge is something that I know I've talked about quite a bit, both here at Conversations and in my weekly newsletter. But the quick summary of what it is it's a national grant program trying to help disadvantaged communities rebuild their workforces around the country. It's a national program, about 500 million in total funding. We applied and put together a proposal for about $23 million to create a national workforce development team that would, in essence, create a franchisable model for space workforce development. We would pair this with our Space Ready certification program, where this grant would pay for trainers to come in and create the framework for a space curriculum at community and technical colleges, adapting what already exists, tweaking where it needs to. We come in behind, certify the school as being space ready, and in exchange for these initial schools being funded through the grant for this training program, they have to agree to train other schools instructors. And so in essence, we create this self-reinforcing loop where I call it a Ponzi scheme for good, where the first school has to commit to training a certain number of instructors from other schools before they start training students, and the same on down the line. So that way we're able to spread this franchise out with little to no upfront cost to these community and technical colleges. What we're looking ahead for in this workforce plan. So as I mentioned, this franchise model, we're trying to determine, regardless of whether we get the grant to implement this, what does that need to look like? We have the shell of that that we submitted with the proposal, but with the grant decisions not expected until summer of 22, we have a little bit of time here to build out that plan. So instead of just waiting until the grant's decided to actually start any of the legwork, we are beginning the process now of going back to partners who agreed to help and trying to find new partners interested and determining what is it they need on day one. The same day we find out we have money that can be turned on, what is it you're going to need? When are you going to need it? What can we start now? What are those, concept plans and documents that can start being worked on now? We're also working on designing a industry-wide workforce development survey. Yesterday, I was talking with the director of the White House's Space Commerce team at the National Space Council. And she was mentioning that that is something that the White House recognizes is a huge gap in information, that they just don't know what needs there are for workers, what companies are doing about filling the needs they do have, and even what workers exist. And so we're going to be working with that office to design this survey and then turn around and go out to industry and find out that very thing. What is the full range of jobs that are open in the space sector? What are those professions that are needed but unable to be filled? And how is it companies want their existing workforce programs to be improved? And so if you are involved in a space company right now and think you all might be interested in participating in this survey, please reach out to us and we'll make sure we integrate you all in that survey. Obviously, we won't be able to touch every company in the sector, but we're trying to make this as representative as possible. So that way, when the White House and the National Space Council are making decisions, they actually do have a survey that's a scientifically valid representative sample that's statistically significant. All right, I think that just about does it for me. I think I have a little under 1 minute. That may be my best timing yet for sliding in under the wire and not stealing anybody's time.
I don't know, you're usually pretty good. So that was really interesting about the survey, working with the White House. That'll be um, an important step because you do hear a lot of people talk about workforce development and the challenges that this industry has, but nobody seems to have verified whether that's really a problem or whether it's just a lack of creativity in reaching the people who are qualified for these positions.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. I think companies still think the model is we put up an announcement on our own website and magically everybody who was ever interested in space will see it. And
Yep.
I think that's not how it's working these days. I think you got to go where the people are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.